My presentation today is based on my best-selling book, 100 Plus, How the Coming Age of Longevity Will Change Everything, from careers and relationships to family and faith. I always like to start a presentation with a personal story. So this is a photo of my grandfather when he was in his late 90s, riding a horse. He grew up riding horses for transport. That's how they got to and from school. It was definitely a different time. And here he's doing it for fun with my Aunt Susan. He was my example of longevity. He was somebody who was really healthy all his life. Everybody in my family wanted to be that. That's what we aspired to be and still aspire to be. He passed away a few years ago at 103. But he was literally healthy until the day he died. He did push-ups every morning and sit-ups and all of that. And so that's what we try to do in our family, hoping that we're going to have that kind of life expectancy and maybe better, as you'll see as we go through the presentation, depending on how technology winds up helping us. He was, around the same time that he was riding the horse, he was very ambitious. He heard that my cousin was going to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Has anyone climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in here? I knew there would be a few. It's hard. And he started training for it because he thought maybe he'd go with my cousin. His doctors eventually talked him out of that. I'm not sure that I would go, and so I'm glad they talked him out of it. But he was ambitious, very ambitious. But he wasn't rare, and what I mean by that is he was a centenarian, but there's lots of centenarians now. The population's growing. Back in 1900, there were only 15,000 centenarians in the United States. In 2010, there were 53,000. You can see in this tiny snapshot of time, over 30 years, that it grew by 20K. And by the year 2050, experts are predicting that there'll be over 600,000 centenarians in the United States alone, and that's based on today's technology. And what do we know about today's technology? I mean, technology does not stay static. It's dynamic. It's always changing and it's improving. But before we get to some of the tech that's improving, let's take a quick look back at history. This is probably one of humanity's greatest achievements of all time, taking average life expectancy from 18 in the Cro-Magnon area where we were running away from tigers and lions, all the way up to 80 years old, and beyond that, 80 years in America and beyond that in other countries. Monaco's up at 90 years. So this is really great, and some people will look at this and say, oh, well, it's somewhat misleading because if you look at the chart in the beginning, it's like, well, yes, the reason why the line goes up in the beginning is because of the low-hanging fruit, the easy things we did to make ourselves live longer, the things that we stopped. We avoided things that killed us early on in our life, right? So better sanitation, better nutrition, reductions in infant mortality, all of those kinds of things, germ theory. That's how the line started going up in the beginning. But the line continues to go up in the second half of the 20th century because of things that we did to avoid death later on in life. Better therapies for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, all of those things that are killing us later on. And it's not perfect. We haven't solved everything yet, but we've extended life expectancy, but also health expectancy. And that's one of the things I actually make a big distinction about in my book and as I'm speaking about this topic, because nobody's really interested in life expectancy without health expectancy. You want to extend your health, not your life. So it's health expectancy that we're really concerned about here. And our health expectancy is about to grow. That line is going to keep going up and probably at a steeper curve now that biology has become an engineering project. And so what do I mean by that? Just like computers are based on ones and zeros, the human body has a code too, the A, C, T, and G of DNA, right? And this actually, by the way, is how I got interested in this subject. I live in Silicon Valley. A friend of mine is this really talented hacker. Back it was probably around 2002, 2003, right after the first draft of the human genome had been sequenced in 2000, I went over to my friend's house and walked into his living room, and he had all these books on intro to biology. I was like, what are all these biology books doing all over your living room? I'm like, are you changing careers? Because that would be ridiculous because you're such a great hacker. And he looked at me, and he's like, no. He's like, today I'm hacking computer code. Tomorrow I'm going to be hacking biology. Like, he just said that matter of fact. Right? And that was way back then, and he has actually since gone on to start a biotech company. So he was prescient in that. once you have a code, what's the first thing you do? You read it, right? And then after you read it, you can start writing it, right? And how do you write biological code? Well, maybe through gene therapy or CRISPR, if you've heard of CRISPR. So I wanted to bring your attention to the cost of sequencing, because some people think about this and say, well, you know, the first draft of the human genome was completed in 2000. It's 2018. There's been 18 years. How come we don't have a whole bunch of therapies on the market to edit our code and make us healthier, right? How come it's taken so long? 18 years is a long time. Well, this is the reason. It cost $2.7 billion to sequence the first human genome. And then it came down to 100 million, and then a deal at 10 million, 100 million, then only 100K, right, for a single genome. I mean, that's a huge amount of money, and that meant that scientists couldn't really do a lot with it. And it wasn't until just fairly recently. Has anyone in the room had their genome sequenced, by the way? Yeah, look at this. So there's probably 10 of you, 15 of you maybe. I've had mine done as well. Full genome. I've had my full genome sequenced through Veritas. That's George Church's company. He's one of the pioneers in this area. Anyway, first the scientists need to get a lot of data. They need to get a lot of genome sequenced before they can start seeing patterns and figuring out what they might even want to edit, right? And that's happening now, actually. I think we're really going to see an explosion in gene editing therapies in the next 5 to 10 years, which is exciting because, I mean, think about it. You can edit out single gene mutations that cause disease, like Huntington's, for instance, or edit in code that can help you live longer, like, say, the FOXO longevity gene, or there's groups of people around the world who live longer, and they have healthy lifestyles, but there's also genetic groups of people who live around the world who live longer, and they have slightly different code than the rest of us. And so that's exciting that maybe someday we could figure out how everybody could have that rather than relying on the genetic lottery. So aside from gene editing, one of the things I'm super excited about in terms of longevity is tissue engineering, regenerative medicine, the ability to grow brand new human organs out of your own adult stem cells. So in this case, growing a trachea, that was one of the sort of first organs that was done for humans, real humans, and we're not talking lab animals here. Bladders have been done for humans. Skin has been grown in the lab for humans. Muscle has been grown in the lab for real people. So science fiction, I mean, it sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? Swapping out body parts. But it's not. It's reality. And it's only for a select few who get to be a part of the clinical trial or who are part of the military and come back and get to take part in these types of things. But at some point, that technology is going to leave the lab, and it's going to become more widespread. And the ability to swap out if your trachea isn't working and get a brand new one made out of your own biological material is incredible, right? That will help extend health expectancy pretty radically. Hearts are in the works right now, not only growing full ones, but just repairing them with heart patches and things, which is actually looking a lot better in terms of the science. So there's a lot going on there. Artificial intelligence as well is another thing that I'm excited about from the longevity perspective, because it's really helping with diagnostics now. We're seeing this locally where I live in California, where the AI is outperforming radiologists at Stanford University. I mean, it's incredible. And AI doesn't get tired or after a long shift, right? So there's regenerative medicine, tissue engineering, AI, and then microbiome. I know there's been some talk of the microbiome over the last couple of days, but how your gut affects your health. There's a lot more knowledge being generated about that right now, too, and how that might be changed for people and help them live healthier lives. So this brings us to the meat of my book, which is, so what? Right? So we're going to live a lot longer and a lot healthier because of things not only that you're doing for yourselves, but also things that you'll have access to coming down the pike from scientists and technologists. So what? So what if we could roughly double our life expectancy and live to 150 years old in a healthy state? Not in a decrepit state, but in a healthy state. How does that change the world? That's what I was interested in, and that's why I wrote this book. because I wanted to sort of extrapolate from history and take a look back, because as you saw from the chart before, we've already done it. We've gone from having a 43-year life expectancy to an 80-year life expectancy. So we've already sort of roughly doubled life expectancy. So what if we do it again? What does that mean for everything, right? So, well, one of the first things, and this is actually the most studied area, when I dove into all the different areas related to longevity, economists have been obsessed with wealth and longevity for a very long time. In fact, a Nobel Prize was won based on this topic. We get wealthier as we live longer and healthier lives in many different ways. I'll just zoom in here. Gains in life expectancy over the last century are worth over 1.2 million per person to the current population in the United States. And this makes sense. Scholars have known for a long time that if you're wealthy, it's easy to be healthy, because if you have money, you can pay for the right doctors, and you can have the right nutrition and all of that. But they didn't spend very much time thinking about the opposite. If you're healthy, then maybe that leads to wealth. And only recently, in the past decade or so, have scholars really been thinking about the inverse relationship. If you're healthy, that creates wealth. And it makes sense, because if you're healthy, then you can work. If you're healthy, you can be productive. If you're healthy, you can come up with new ideas. And that not only is good for the individual, but it's good for the entire society. So David Canning and David Bloom from Harvard and Queen's University did a very interesting study a few years ago, where they showed that if you took two economies that were roughly the same type of economy, it's just that one had a 5-year longevity advantage over the other one, the one with the advantage would grow 0.5% faster than the other one. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but when average annual growth is about 2% a year, that's actually pretty significant. And that's only with a 5-year longevity advantage. What if you had a 10-year advantage, or a 20-year advantage, or a 30-year advantage? It might not be linear, but it probably still would continue to grow. And so that's very interesting from an international competitiveness point of view. And also within societies, when you take a look at the wealthy versus the poor, and who gets access to these technologies first. Related to that is the idea of innovation. So Da Vinci was 51 when he painted the Mona Lisa. As I mentioned, I live in Silicon Valley, and there's this myth where I live that all new, interesting innovation comes from young people, right? Mark Zuckerberg was in college when he started Facebook, and Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were in their 20s when they started Apple, and Larry Page and Sergey Brin were also in their 20s when they started Google, and so young people must be the source of all innovation, right? No, not at all, actually. When you dig into the research and you talk to scholars who study innovation and who've spent a lot of time actually looking at the data, it turns out that innovation peaks around 40. And one of the reasons they think innovation peaks around 40 is that's when you've had enough time to sort of see the world. You've learned a lot about a bunch of different things, and at 40 is when you can start to say, hey, this thing I learned over here might connect with this thing over here. Why don't I put them together? And wow, something brand new, right? But then after 40, it starts to go downhill. And nobody's really tried to explain that, other than, oh, people just get old. So, well, what if people stayed healthier for longer periods of time? And instead of worrying about their health after 40, they could just keep thinking about ideas and interesting new things, right? Would innovation extend? Probably. And so that's exciting for the future if we can extend health expectancy, because we'll extend innovation, which will also lead to greater wealth. Education gains. Society tends to become more educated as they live longer. This is just a chart of high school, but it makes sense, because if you can live longer, then you're more willing to put in time to get educated, because you have more time to benefit from that education after the fact. If you think you're just going to sort of die early, then why bother getting educated? Because, you don't have that much time to benefit from it. And so with longer lives, there'll be time to get educated and get re-educated and re-educated, which actually might make it a good time to think about retirement and how retirement might start to change in a world of longer-lived people. Right now, people retire and sort of go out to the pasture to rest or go traveling or whatever they do. But maybe in the future, in the not so distant future actually, when you can live a lot longer, retirement might come to mean taking off time to go get re-educated, or taking off time to go have kids and then re-entering the workforce and doing something brand new. So a lot of our phases of life are going to come to be redefined, including marriage, probably. The average age of first marriage has been increasing for a number of years. You can see that it was 23 and 20 in 1950 for men and women, and then 29 and 27 later on today. That's not a huge jump, considering how far life expectancy has jumped. And I think one of the reasons for that is because fertility has stayed static. And there's still that biological clock ticking. But what happens when women can have children at older ages? Already that's happening. The percentage of first births after age 35 has skyrocketed. All of us in the room probably have anecdotal evidence of that. I was over 35 when I had my first son. But it's still sort of capped. The technology is growing to allow women to have children, their own biological children, at later and later times. The ability to grow eggs in the lab from a woman's own cells taken from her ovarian tissue, for instance, that's possible now. And so it probably won't be too far off until women can have their own biological children at much later and later ages. And that will probably affect how old people are when they get married. And it'll affect what family structure and what families look like in the future as well. I think probably the first question that comes to people's minds when they hear about health extension and life extension is what happens to the population. So if we can all live a really long time, isn't the population going to explode, right? I mean, that's the first thing I personally thought when I started thinking about this. And the answer is it depends. You can see from this chart that world population growth rates are tanking. And the reason for that is because fertility rates are tanking. When I was doing research into this chapter of my book, I found an interesting study out of the University of Chicago by a couple of demographers where they took a look at the country of Sweden. And they said, okay, well, what if we took the entire country of Sweden and we said that tomorrow everybody is immortal? Like they never die. So not even just to 150, they just never die. What happens to population growth over the next 100 years? And they took all of that data, and they always use Sweden because the data is really easy and clean and easy to use, and popped it into the World Bank model and the UN model, and waited for the results to come out. The results came out, and it turned out that over 100 years, if everybody were immortal, population would grow by 22%. I mean, that's high, but it's not nearly as high as I would have expected it to be. And so I called them up, and I was just explain to me why this is. Like, why wouldn't it be higher? And they said to me, well, it's because heavy population growth is fueled by more births, not fewer deaths. And the reason for that is that births are exponential. A woman can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, she can have many, many children. Whereas if one person doesn't die, that's only one person, and that doesn't become exponential. And so that's why population growth is really driven by fertility rates, not by death rates. But still, as we just talked about, who knows what's going to happen with fertility rates? I mean, if reproductive technology continues to get better and better, and women can have children later and later, you could imagine a scenario where a woman has a child at 22 and then waits a while and then has another child at 55 or something. That could happen. So it's unclear, actually, what's going to happen to fertility rates in the future. But for now, growth rates are going down and fertility rates are tanking, even in areas of the world that you wouldn't expect it, like the Middle East. So even if population isn't a big deal, we still need to think about the environment. We want the world to be clean, right? And more people, even if growth rates are tanking, there's more people, means that there's more people using resources and creating garbage and all of that. And so what is the answer to that? or what can we think of in terms of answers? And I think this is when we need to think about the role of human capital. This human capital is the reason why Thomas Malthus was wrong about human beings overpopulating and not having enough resources, about why Paul Ehrlich was wrong with the population bomb that we'd all be starving in the 1970s because we'd all run out of food. In fact, the opposite is true. We're fighting an obesity crisis in many, many parts of the world. There's too much food and bad quality food as well. So human capital is basically people's ideas. It's their brains, it's their experience, their innovations. And it only takes 1 out of 1 million to come up with some brilliant idea that's going to completely change the world. There's probably one of you in the room today. So human capital is what Malthus forgot about and what Paul Ehrlich forgot about. So here's one example that I was thinking of. What are some really big examples I could sort of talk about in terms of how human capital is changing the environment for us now? You've all probably heard about Sweden's experiment with waste to energy, how they're taking garbage, burning it, and using the energy from that to create power. And then, they're having to import garbage now because they don't have enough garbage, and so they're importing it. And some people look at this and say, oh, well, I'm not so sure I like this because maybe it's going to disincentivize people to recycle, or there could be other ways to do this. But I think this is actually an improvement. This is better than putting garbage in the ground and having methane gas leak and garbage leaching into groundwater and all of that. I mean, this is an improvement. It's not perfect, but it's one step up. And then somebody else with another idea is going to come around and make this even better. Now, I was looking at a company. I invest in longevity companies as well. And I was looking at a company a few days ago about one of the things they're doing is capturing carbon out of the air and turning it into carbon nanotubes that creates this material that's stronger than steel. I was thinking, wow, wouldn't that be cool if they could just if the burning of the garbage is releasing a bit of CO2 in the air, and then this carbon capture company comes along. I mean, it all kind of fits together, doesn't it? But we'll see. But this is sort of where we are in terms of the garbage. The ocean really needs to be cleaned up. There's plastic everywhere. It's terrible and disgusting. You've all seen photos of sea life with, plastic wrapped around them, right? I mean, it's awful. There's a lot of cleanup that needs to happen. So one of the bright spots in that area, has anyone here heard of the Ocean Cleanup Project? Boyan Slat? Yeah, so lots of people in here. I think it's a really cool idea. Dutch entrepreneur has created these sort of passive floating devices with screens on them. They don't go very deep into the water, and they've got a bit of an anchor on them. And they float in the same direction the plastic floats. So his idea is that to catch plastic, you have to act like plastic. And so they're actually testing it right now in the area where I live. I'm following them on Twitter. They've been pulling it out into the ocean and seeing if it works. And they're going to do a big test this summer. And so the idea is that these screens go out and catch the plastic, and then a garbage truck will go periodically, pick up the garbage and leave, and then wait for more to get caught, and then pick it up and leave. And at least this is an idea. It might not be perfect, it might not work perfectly, but this is something. It's better than leaving this big, this Great Pacific Garbage Patch is 3 times the size of France. Or if you live in America, it's 3 times the size of Texas. That is huge. So I'm happy that this idea has been created, and I sincerely hope it works. But if it doesn't, hopefully somebody else with a better idea will come along and build upon this. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was it's not quite, well, this looks like good news, I suppose. It's not quite as good of news as all the human capital stuff. So these are top 10 countries in life expectancy. Monaco's at the top at 90, then Japan, Singapore. You notice the US isn't on there. They're way down at number 43, actually, under Turks and Caicos, for a number of reasons. The opioid crisis doesn't help. Then the bottom 10 countries, Chad is down at the bottom at 50. So we had 50 and 90, right? So a 40-year divide between countries internationally. That's pretty much how old I am, right? My life is sort of the divide between the bottom and the top, which is huge. And as life-extending technologies come on the market, the wealthy always get it first. People in wealthier countries will have access to it first. And so they'll start living much, much longer. And so the question is how much of a time lag will there be between the people in the countries that get to live, say, 150, and the people still at Chad living at 50? There could be a 100-year divide at some point in the near future. Then what? That's a recipe for chaos. And it doesn't only exist internationally, by the way. It exists within countries. I mean, even in Northern California, where I live, in a short 3-mile span, in Atherton, the life expectancy is 80 years, and over in East Palo Alto, it's around 60 years. That's a 20-year divide. What happens when that grows much, much more? I mean, people may literally start fighting for their lives. And it's also just not fair, and it's not good. And I think this is something that we need to work on. And the question is, I think one of the things that we need to think about is whether or not biology will be more like an information technology, or if it will be more like it always kind of has been in the past, just sort of biology, slow moving, right? If it's more like an information technology, you saw in the previous chart with the genomic sequencing that it was actually moving faster than Moore's law, right? So that was good. That's kind of more like an information technology, right? If it's like that, then that's good news, because that means that health extending technologies might get distributed faster than in the past. You can see here, this is how long it took for various technologies to get dispersed within the US to a quarter of the population. 46 years for electricity. And you go down, it only took 7 years. So it's getting, over time, technology is rolling out faster. But will biotech, will longevity tech be on that kind of trajectory? I don't know the answer to that, actually. I think some of it is. You know, obviously the genomic sequencing is, right? That'll be so cheap at some point that everybody can get it, and it won't even be thought about. But I don't know, growing a new organ, maybe that will continue to be expensive. So it's unclear. And so I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges for us with health expectancy and longevity in the long run. And then one last thought I'll leave you with is that you shouldn't be like this guy, sitting on a train track, reading a newspaper, waiting for the train of death to come mow him down. You should instead be thinking about what you could do. I mean, I think this is actually one of the most important issues of all time, because it literally has to do with our lives, right? I would like to be part of the first generation to live to 150 years in a healthy state, rather than one of the last of the generation to live to 80 years. Because the revolution is coming. It's just a question of when. And I would like to be in that new generation that gets to live longer. And so if you agree with me, then you should think about what you can do personally. I mean, I think if you're a journalist, you can write about it. If you're a philanthropist, you can donate it to it. If you're an investor, you can invest in longevity companies. There's all different things that you can do, even if you're not a longevity scientist. So my message is, don't be complacent and try to make this happen sooner rather than later. Thank you.